Welcome to Rudetuna's Arcade. I'm your host RT, and today we're going to be taking a look at 14 NES beat 'em up games. Now the list I compiled today consists of games that some are considered they have fighting game elements, some of the games have platforming elements, and some have RPG elements. However, at the end of the game, they all are majority beat 'em up style games. Now I'm sure I've missed somebody's favorites on this list, and that's because the NES library of this style of game is just too vast for me to cover in one video, otherwise I'd be here like 3 hours. Another thing to mention with this list is they're in the order that I prefer the game, but there are no wrong answers, so take my order of the list with a grain of salt. I'm sure there's going to be some that you guys put higher than others that I have in my list, and if that's the case, which I'm sure it is, please feel free to let me know in the comments below. But I will say pretty much every game on this list is decent and represents the NES beat 'em up style in a good light. With that said guys, let's start at number 14. So at number 14 we have Urban Champion. Now this game came out in 1984, however I didn't play it until 1986-1987 time frame. This was pretty much during the beginning of the NES's life cycle, this game. And it offered two game variations, game A being versus the computer and game B with 2 players. So I'm going to say off the bat with this game, I highly recommend playing with 2 players, and you'll see why in a minute. Now with it being a Nintendo made game, one of the things it definitely stands out with is its NES charm. And by charm I mean the music. Early NES games often had that same type of game where you can tell, even though it was a game on the system, you can tell Nintendo made it with their style of music they put in. The game's pretty simplistic. It starts off where you can control the character on the left with the blue hair and his doppelganger on the right with the green hair. If you're playing in a 1-player mode, you're always going to be the character on the left. 2-player is going to be on the right hand side. And the object of this game is to punch the other character and knock them off the screen. After you get them to the 3rd screen, a manhole will appear, and when you knock them off that time, they'll fall into the manhole, thus being the match over. So your attacks are a heavy punch and a jab punch. So when you hit your opponent with a heavy punch, they roll on the ground and fly backwards. Your goal is to push the other person off the screen. The jab is a lot quicker, and all it does is really stun and interact with your opponent. So to really move your opponent, you have to hit them with the uppercut button or they push backwards. Now one thing I will point out with this game, but a lot of people sleep on, is the fact that you can actually dodge punches as well. So by pushing back on the controller as a punch comes towards you, you can dodge it and then gain time and counteract and hit your opponent. Another thing you can do is you can alternate between the face and the body. So while you're trying to knock your opponent to the other side of the screen, occasionally this lady will pop up at the top and she'll try to drop a vase on somebody. You can easily sidestep it, or if you get hit with it, you'll go into a stun animation and your opponent gets a free hit. Same thing with this other guy. He's a lot more aggressive and a lot more angry when he drops it out. But he does pretty much the same thing. If you get hit by it, you're stunned and your opponent gets a free attack. Another part of this game is the police. Now the police will come by sometimes, and then when they do, both characters will separate, go to the beginning parts of the sides of the screen that they started the game on. And I like Nintendo's charm right here when they made the guys whistle, try to play it off like they're not really doing anything. One thing to note though, that could be good or bad. Depending on where you are at the screen, if you got your opponent towards the edge of the screen, everything will reset once the police car comes, so keep that in mind. Now with all that said, there's not a whole lot more to it, and this game constantly loops over and over. There is no ending for it. Every time you win 3 rounds, you'll get this little boxing glove icon at the bottom, and the more wins you round, they'll be replaced with flags. It look like flags kind of, and then the last part would be trophies, and that's kind of where the game just loops over and over again. The game for you, if you're playing 1 player, is over once you get knocked into the manhole. So basically you can get knocked off the screen 3 times before the game being over. So overall, this is a pretty fun game, but it does get repetitive and gets old real quick. But I felt like it was definitely worth a mention on this list. Next up on this list, we have Double Dragon 3. Now this game's tricky because it was made by Acclaim, but on the next screen it says Technos Japan. Now, I have to think maybe they did a corroboration of some sorts. I'm not 100% sure, but in my opinion, it doesn't play like a typical Technos Japan game, as you'll see some of those further on down the list, some of the games made by Technos Japan. However, in my opinion, it's still an overall pretty good game. Now this game was based off the arcade game of Double Dragon 3, and that game was a colossal failure. and probably deserves a video of its own just showing how bad the game is and what made it so bad and what turned off so many fans of the Double Dragon franchise. However, this game actually does function as a serviceable NES beat 'em up game. And I gotta give him props here. It's basically putting lipstick on a pig trying to save the horrible debacle that was Double Dragon 3 in the arcade. And while the NES game did maintain a lot of the arcade's likenesses and ideas, it polished them up nicely and made it a much better game than the arcade in my opinion. So the story of Double Dragon 3 is basically a year after the events of the last adventure in the Double Dragon series, and once again, in typical fashion, Marion vanishes. And then we're introduced to a mysterious person named Hiraku that lets Billy and Jimmy know that Marion's captors will release her after the Double Dragon twins deliver 3 sacred stones of power. So basically you traverse the world going to different countries trying to find these stones. Now as far as gameplay goes, this does serve as a functioning beat 'em up game and is actually pretty fun. In my opinion, not the best in the series, but a pretty good addition. The sounds are similar to Double Dragon 2 in the sense of when you do your moves and the style of music in my opinion. I feel like Double Dragon 2 did have better music. But this isn't horrible, just not as good as the others in the series. As far as difficulty, the difficulty's not too bad in this game. One thing to note in this game with the enemies though, they are very aggressive. And they are not shy about double teaming you. Also potentially if they get you in a corner, they will stand over you and keep spamming their attacks. So be mindful of that. So basically Billy and Jimmy's attacks are a somersault flip. Basically when you jump over the character, you can grab them in midair and toss your opponent. They have a series of punches and kicks, a drop kick. They also introduced a run feature in this game. And best of all, they do have their iconic cyclone kick. And you do it the same way you do in Double Dragon 2. Jump when you're almost at the peak of your jump, press the kick button, and he'll perform his cyclone kick. And that's the move you're probably gonna spam the most in the whole game, as it's really good for clearing out areas of enemies and getting the enemy off you when they surround you, as well as also being effective with knocking enemies off the screen. Now another feature in this game that's often overlooked, maybe not because a lot of people just didn't know about it, was the fact that you do have weapons. You have weapons that the enemy drops, plus each character that you have has their own dedicated weapon. So when you go to the select screen where you pick your characters, you can see where it says bare hand and whatever weapon they have. I highly recommend saving these weapons for boss fights, because the bosses do take a lot of damage on this game, and you can definitely get some easy hits in with your weapon. Another unique feature that Double Dragon 3 offered was the fact that, in the same manner of some Neo Geo games and Castlevania 3, some of the bosses that you encounter in this game will actually join your team later once they're defeated. So one of the characters we can unlock is Chin. And he's not like the ones in Double Dragon 2, the shirtless guys with the bow haircuts. He looks completely different. But if you ask me, I feel like he looks more like Android 19 from Dragon Ball Z. Now each character has the basic attacks, a punch, a kick, and a jump kick, and whatnot. Sometimes they do vary with different attacks and different strengths and weaknesses. For example, Chin here is slower than the other characters, but at the same time he does hit a lot harder. And when he does his jump kick, he actually hits the opponent 2 times. Also, his weapon is different from the nunchucks. He actually has a claw that he uses. It's basically a punch and attack with extension and does more damage. Overall though, I think he's probably the weakest of the cast due to him being so slow and his attacks taking so long to come out. But used in the right hands, he can still be viable. Another character we have that you can unlock is Ranzo, and basically he's a shinobi type ninja, and he's probably the best character in the game in my opinion, due to the fact that he's fast, has the best jump in the game, some of his attacks knock you down in one hit, he has long range with his sword, and his jump kick is stupid because it jumps so high in the air and he can put his hands out and the attack stays the whole time while he's in his animation, for having high priority over a lot of characters in the game. So in my opinion, definitely the best character in the game. If you're playing the game and the character is defeated, that character is gone, and then you have a choice of other characters you can use throughout the game. So basically, if you're low with one character's health, it's a good idea to switch out and change to a fresh character or a character with more health. As far as difficulty goes, you'll be able to beat this game no problem. Might take a couple of playthroughs, but it's really not a lot of hard jumping like in other games, other platformers. Most jumps are pretty straightforward, and the bosses are reasonable. So this game is definitely a good playthrough, but there are definitely, in my opinion, higher games on the list. But overall, a solid experience. Next up at number 12, we have Renegade. Now Renegade was made by Taito of America, and basically this game had an arcade counterpart as well. I feel like this game stayed true to the arcade for the most part, some elements being a little different, but for the most part, it did stay true to the arcade. One thing to note as well, there is a Japanese version of this game, and the character sprites look completely different, more in line with traditional garbs worn in Japan, especially among high school students. And the storyline is a little bit different, but that's a video for another time. Today we're taking a look at the American version of Renegade. Now this game came out in 1987 and was actually a pretty solid game at its time, and it did introduce some different elements that traditional games weren't doing at the time. Another thing I want to point out real quick before I get into the game is at the screen, you see right here where it has player level. A lot of people, believe it or not, didn't know that there were different levels of difficulty for this game. So to change your level of difficulty, you'd have to push directions on the D-pad to change and cycle through the levels of difficulty. Level 1 being the easiest, level 2 being harder, and so forth. So Renegade was a one-player game where it didn't offer two players on the screen at the same time. So if you play a two-player game, you would just take turns alternating play. And the gameplay is pretty simplistic. You have a punch, a jump kick, a back kick. You can actually perform running attacks as well. You can grab, attack your opponent, and throw them. So pretty basic stuff for a beat 'em up game. One thing, you could also perform a ground mount as well. And sometimes that could be great because whenever you'd mount an opponent that was on the ground, at various times throughout the game, you'd punch them and a heart would fly up. And those represented an extra life. So if you found a character that was on the ground, you hit him, don't finish him off. It's a good idea to mount the opponent, punch him once, and then get off and see if any hearts fly up. If you find that, definitely maximize it until that particular opponent is dead and get all the lives from them you can. The music on this game was pretty awesome in my opinion. It stayed true to the arcade in a sense, a little faster. And one thing Nintendo was synonymous for was they often added new parts of the game that weren't in the original arcade counterparts. The motorcycle stage. Now the sprites aren't as good as the arcade, but I feel like they stand up on their own. Now this game offered pretty good graphics, smooth gameplay, and a little bit of slowdown here and there, but overall a pretty fast experience. The controls were responsive, and the AI with difficulty level was probably just right. Not too hard, but at the same time, challenging enough. Another feature that Renegade had that a lot of games weren't doing at the time, with the exception of Double Dragon of course, and I think it might have been a Tatos thing, was the direction you faced when you did your attacks. If you were facing left and you punched the attack and you pushed the punch button, punch would come out. However, if you turned the direction, the same button you press to do the punches would reverse and do your kicks. So basically, depending on what direction you're facing when you're doing your attacks, will depend on what attack comes out, which can be confusing at first. I know the first time I ever saw it was Double Dragon 2 Arcade, and Renegade Arcade followed the same format. So that's one thing they did carry over from the arcade that takes a little bit of getting used to. And the game did have a handful of power-ups along the way. It did have the S icon right here. When you picked it up, you did go extra fast and knock over your opponents on the bike. And also it had a P icon. If you picked it up, it gave him super strength. When you knock the opponent, you hit the opponent with it, they fly across the screen. And if you hit a downed opponent, instead of having to mount him and hit him multiple times, when you hit him once, the opponent just died. And they were random, they'd show up randomly at times. Now the game could be kind of short as there were only 4 levels, and you could clear the game pretty quick. However, in my opinion, for what it offered, it was a pretty fun experience all the way through. The last part of the game kind of had mazes where you got into the building and you had to go through certain doors through a certain sequence to access the final boss. So if you didn't know where you were going, that actually could take a long time. The final boss is Sabu, and basically he's dangerous for the most part because he takes a lot of damage when he hits you, and he can actually one-shot you. No pun intended, he can literally one-shot you, and that's pretty much it. But eventually, with drop kicks and that strategy I was talking about, run over him, keep knocking him on the ground, you'll overcome this villain. So overall, I'd say a solid game on this list. Next up at number 11, we have Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3, The Manhattan Project. Now, I know a lot of people put this game higher up, so like I said earlier, take it with a grain of salt. There are great games in this library, and this game had to go somewhere. So, getting on with it, the game came out in 1992 and was made by Konami. It followed after the highly success of Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade edition. And this game definitely delivered in the typical one turtle and two turtle gameplay. So the game starts off with the turtles being on vacation. They get a message from Shredder, and basically Shredder's captured April and hijacked Manhattan. So it's up to the turtles to get it back. So what this game offers is you can be all 4 turtles, not all 4 on the screen at one time. However, you could play 2-player, and it was actually a pretty good experience. And you can cycle through the characters. You could be Donatello, Michelangelo, Leonardo, and Raphael. So it does play different from Ninja Turtles 2 arcade in some ways, even though the games do look similar. I feel like on this game the graphics were a little bit better because they were kind of their own thing. The intro was very nice at the beginning, and the turtles' attacks basically, when you push both buttons at the same time, each turtle has their own individual attack. However, in the style of Final Fight, it will take a little bit of your life each time you use it, so use it sparingly. You can spam it, but use it sparingly, because the pizza pickups in this game aren't as abundant as the first Turtles game. So you basically have the option of a long attack. If you push down an attack, you'll basically one-shot your opponent by flipping them over your head for the most part, and then you can also use your special attack that pretty much instantly kills an opponent for the most part when you hit them with it. Also, you can deflect projectiles that are thrown at you by the enemy, and this pretty much plays in typical standard form. And you'll fight different variations of the foot soldiers. And another thing with this game, it did introduce a lot of new bosses into the game. You have your classics like Rocksteady and Bebop, with a host of new enemy bosses as well. So in this game, each time you lose a turtle, you're given the choice to pick the same turtle you had before, or you can pick any of the other three. And also in typical turtle fashion, you do have the stages where you're on surfboards with scrolling enemies, also on the surfboards as well. So this game does take a lot of elements from the Ninja Turtles 2 arcade game. Now, one thing I will say that this game does better than the Turtles 2 arcade game is it gives each turtle their own unique personality in a sense. And what I mean by that is their own playstyle, I should say. Because they do have different special moves, and to me it seems like the range and the weapons are a little different. So I think Konami did a really good job with this game. I just prefer the Ninja Turtles 2 arcade a little better, and I'll tell you why when we get to that game. But overall, this is definitely a great entry into the series. Next up at number 10, we have POW, also known as Prisoners of War. Now this game also had an arcade counterpart as well. And the arcade plays a little bit different from the POW version for the NES. And again, like I always say in Nintendo fashion, they do add a lot of elements that the arcade didn't have. Now one thing to note with this game is it's only one player. The arcade version you could play with two people at the same time, but this one, only one person at a time. So basically the story in this game is you're infiltrating the enemy base in disguise as a prisoner of war, and you're supposed to break out of prison and destroy all the enemy leaders. Pretty simplistic plot, but effective. One thing I do like about this game, it did take a lot of elements from the arcade, and pretty much did have the same move list. And while there is platforming in this game, there's no serious platforming where you're going to jump and fall to your death for the most part. And this game's pretty straightforward as you traverse each level. One thing they did do that I thought was pretty cool is they kept the same enemies from the arcade and put them in the NES game. Now, one thing that this game has is power-ups. You can go into these little huts on the maze or any kind of door that's open pretty much on each level, and you can kill one. And once you kill all the enemies in there, they'll drop various power-ups. One being brass knuckles, one being armor, and one getting a life restoration. You can also pick up the gun like you can in the arcade, and this one's a little more generous. It gives you actually more shots for the most part than the arcade does. One thing with the game though, the fighting does get repetitive over time because you do encounter the same 3 or 4 enemies. So enemy variation here is pretty limited. You have the soldiers with the knives, you have the green berets, and you have these Contra looking soldiers. Now each level is pretty long in its own right, and the gameplay for each level is pretty similar. And the levels are pretty on par with the arcade, up to like the 2nd or 3rd level. And then in my opinion, it does branch off a little bit, still holding some of that similarity, but kind of being its own thing. I highly recommend playing the arcade version of this game as well. So basically your moves in this game are punch, a kick, a jump kick, a back fist, and any weapon you pick up, you can attack with your weapon. So if you have the gun, you have the option of firing your weapon, or just straight slapping them in the face with it. At the end of each level, you will be presented with a boss fight, which is pretty refreshing after beating up the same enemies over and over and over again. So overall, I'd say this game, while being fun, it does get repetitive over time, but the scenery and the music is just enough to keep your interest to move on to the next level. So overall, I feel like after a couple of playthroughs, you should be able to beat this game with no problem. And one thing to note with this game, while you can't play with 2 people, the game did innovate by adding new features that weren't in the arcade and new level design. I think if this game had 2 players, it would have been that much better. But for what we got, it's still a pretty good game. Next up at number 9, we got Bad Dudes. That came out in 1989. It was made by Data East. Now this game, I think it was a very cool game because it stayed true to the arcade on so many levels. And you could also play with 2 players at one time, which I thought was a great feature. So basically the storyline for this game is the president's been captured and he's sending these 2 bad dudes to go and rescue the president. Pretty straightforward, but in the beat 'em up game, that's all we need. So I remember renting this game back in the day, and what impressed me with the game was how they took everything from the arcade and put it into this game. As far as movesets, the music, and just the overall feel of the game. Basically you have a punch, a kick, a spinning kick, and your power-up move. And basically what that is you hold down the punch button, the character will be engulfed in flames, and then you can release it and execute a super punch. So basically killing everything close by in the vicinity of your punch. So the more people are around when you release the punch, the more damage you'll do. So you can actually hit people that actually didn't get hit by the punch. If they're in that vicinity, they'll actually die. So I thought this was a very nice feature that the arcade had. In the arcade I felt like it worked better, but for the NES I still think it was pretty accurate to its arcade counterpart. As far as graphics and level design, well, in my opinion, they kept everything true to the arcade. You had various power-ups dropped by enemies that you could pick up throughout the game, such as weapons, time clocks, and even a legit Coca-Cola. Now the difficulty on this game is not too bad. I mean, you just have to traverse the maps and kind of memorize where enemies are. But overall, I feel like the game is fair. And they even had throwback bosses like Karnov being the first boss. And they kept the music true to the arcade as well. And every time you cleared a stage, you had the infamous "I'm bad." Which I think on this one you had to cover your ears because they said it, they screamed it out pretty loud. So definitely cover your ears if you're playing this game. Also with the NES's limited capabilities, I feel like they did a really good job with the stages that have horizontal progression, as in the stage right here with the truck. I feel like they did a really good job with the scrolling backgrounds in unison with the truck you're standing on. Back in the 8-bit games, it was hard to do that and do it well, but I think this game actually captured that essence, kind of like the arcade. And the level design on this game is pretty good. You go from the streets to a moving truck to the sewers to the forest. And there's a couple more stages in this game as well, as far as the main base, and then at the end the helicopter. They did a really good job traversing the levels and keeping up a good variety of the stages you're going to play on. So overall, I feel like Bad Dudes was probably one of the better games. As far as true arcade translations, they put all the music in, all the bosses in the right spot they're supposed to be in with all the attacks they had in the arcade. So if you're a fan of Bad Dudes in arcade, and even if it's your first time playing it, you're definitely going to like this one. And I highly recommend giving this one a playthrough. Next up at number 8, we have Battletoads. Made in 1991 by Rare, I feel like this game was one of the more graphic heavy games on the NES platform. And it did a ton of things right. I mean, the gameplay was fun, and while the graphics were good on this game, one thing this game was notorious for was the difficulty. So the game starts off with one of the Battletoads going through space, and him and his girlfriend are captured by the Dark Queen. So in typical beat 'em up fashion, we have Rash and Zitz to come to their rescue. I know we've heard this storyline quite a few times already, but hey, beat 'em up days, that's what it was. You had to get your loved ones back. So basically one of the things I appreciate with this game was the detail of showing you the actual layout of all the stages and where you need to go. And the further you progress, you'll be rewarded with different stages. So one of the things here, I think the graphics are really good, and the style of gameplay. You could actually pick up weapons, charging attacks, where lots of times you can actually soften up your opponent and then charge them and one-shot them off the screen, which I thought was pretty cool. You could actually also play with 2 players at one time on the screen, which was super nice, the co-op feature that they offered. And the game also had a nice variety of enemies. And what set this game apart from other games is that the fact that it offered a lot of different options and ways to play the game. It had platforming elements where you had to be careful where you jumped and had to take the platforming somewhat serious. There were also vehicle stages as well, where you had to ride on the vehicles and dodge obstacles. And it actually did all those things well. Sometimes you can get a game that mixes a bunch of elements and does it poorly. But this game actually pulled it off in my opinion. Like even as early as the first stage, you have elements where you're actually fighting like a typical beat 'em up game, but then it pans out to this mini boss here you fight where you have to throw rocks at the boss. And I thought every time they do things like that, it was a refreshing detour from the mainline game. And the cutscenes I thought were done pretty well. Like for instance here, we have the Dark Queen. Now this was kind of risque for back in the day for Nintendo to even have a character like this on their platform. A little risque, and we can at least say she's probably, in my opinion, 8-bit hot. And another cool feature with the cutscenes were they often didn't say the same thing over and over. So sometimes they would actually have multiple dialogues. So at the end of one stage, she might say one thing, and another stage, they might say something completely different. So I thought just that small attention to detail deserves some type of recognition. Another good touch with Battletoads was the fact that you have this rappelling stage here. Now while challenging, it's still fun because like I say, it breaks up the mainstream of just going back and forth and platforming on a horizontal plane. Another part that I was impressed with this game was the motor vehicle stage, where I like how they innovated back in NES days of giving you a hint of where the next obstacle is going to come out. I think that was imperative to kind of help people get through this level. Otherwise, if they just kept coming out back and forth, this level is already hard by itself, would probably be that much harder. And I appreciate the fact that they put checkpoints in there as well. Now I do feel like, in my opinion, maybe it took a little bit from Excitebike, I don't know, but overall they did this stage pretty well. There's actually even more challenging stages like this the further you progress in the game, such as the infamous Snake stage, which is probably the hardest in the game in my opinion. This game does a good job with the sound effects in the game, and also the music is very memorable and executed very well. And while this game's difficulty is kind of off the charts at times, at the same time, a lot of this game, in my opinion, is actually memorizing the stages and what to do next. The crappy part is, it's very unforgiving because if you don't do something right, pretty much you're gonna die. And you only get so many continues in this game. Now there is a code you can put in to give yourself more lives and stuff like that and continue, but for the most part, if you play this game straight up, you're gonna die over and over and over again until you memorize the pattern on the stage. But even with all that said, I still feel like Battletoads was an instant success and a very fun game to play, if you can get past its frustration and the challenge of difficulty in the levels. This, in my opinion, is definitely one of the harder games on NES. So if you can beat this game, pat yourself on the back, my friend. That is definitely an achievement. So overall, Battletoads, I feel like this was a great game on the NES, and I highly recommend you playing this one. One thing to note with Battletoads though, the popularity was so high on this game that it spawned arcade ports, sequels, and even made their way into fighting games. Next up at number 7, we got Double Dragon 2: The Revenge. Now, this game was made by Acclaim, and this was the first time we'd be introduced to 2-player Double Dragon on the NES. As we know, the first Double Dragon was only 1 player, which was a huge letdown back in the day because Double Dragon Arcade was super popular and a 2-player co-op game took that game over the top. So Double Dragon 2 does reintroduce that aspect. So we actually do have 2-player on this game. 3 levels you can choose from: Practice, Warrior, and Supreme Master. I recommend going with Warrior if it's your first time playing through the game. This takes place after Double Dragon 1, and for some reason Jimmy has become a good guy in the NES lore, and the Shadow Warriors attacked the city and killed Marion this time. So they didn't just, and it's a little more graphic in the arcade. One thing to note, in the arcade, the opening cutscene, they just straight up shoot her. In this one, they just said she's killed, which is still pretty bad. They have a small cutscene of some guy. They actually toned down the cutscene, and they had to do it for NES censorship back in the days. You can't just show somebody shooting somebody like they didn't. You had to tone it down for NES censorship. So one thing you'll notice here, the sprites are actually larger, and they kind of remind me of the Double Dragon 1 game versus mode sprites. So they did a really good job here, and their attack patterns are similar to the game we looked at, Renegade. If you're facing a certain direction, you'll do different things with punches and kicks depending on which direction you're facing. So I think that's something they tried at the beginning, and over time they kind of got away from that, but this game follows that same similar pattern. One thing introduced in this game that they didn't have in Double Dragon 1 or Double Dragon 3 for that matter was the infamous flying knee attack. And this thing pretty much, in my opinion, breaks the game, but I mean, a lot of people didn't know about it at the time. When you first got this game, you just kind of did it on accident, but basically what you do is, once you got knocked on the floor while you're rising off the ground, mash the punch and kick buttons. Now you might can do it with just the kick. I usually push both buttons just to make sure I get it right. If you push the punch button by itself, they'll do a high impact uppercut that'll knock the opponent down. But if you push both buttons, which I always recommend you doing, you'll do this flying knee, and you can do it. You can spam it over and over and over again and clear out a room in no time. They get hit with that knee and they fly all the way across the screen. If there's a platform, you're definitely knocking them off the platform, and more than likely, even if there is no platform, you're going to one-shot them with this one move. So it's definitely broken and abusable. I highly recommend in this game, abuse it. Other than that, the basic stuff: a jump kick, a punch, a kick, a grab. And this is the first time we're introduced to the Cyclone kick. Now, Double Dragon 1 did have a spinning kind of like Van Damme kick, but for the most part, it wasn't like this one. In my opinion, some of the improvements over the first game was the fact that you had 2 players. So this game, for the most part, at the beginning stays true to the arcade with the first stage, and then after that, some elements of the arcade are there, but it kind of ventures off into its own thing. In this game, in my opinion, enemies are a lot more aggressive than the original Double Dragon, and keeps a good flow, but not to the point where they're like stupid. I think the hit collision is good, the game does play at a decent speed, and doesn't have a whole lot of slowdown. Some of the characters are familiar, like Ropar and William and Linda, but they do have a more updated look, which I think fits the game. It's more like I think for Linda, the Mohawk really works, and in this game, she's a lot tougher. She can actually take more than one knockdown. She has an elbow. They've actually improved on the enemy AI in this game. Also, this game does introduce, like the first one, does have a lot of platforming elements in it as well, and you can die pretty easily, and it is pretty easy to miss a jump and fall off of something and die. And lives in this game are pretty important because you only get so many of them. I highly recommend on this game, if you have a chance, definitely try to knock your opponents off the platforms, but you gotta be careful because they will punch you out the air or do a drop kick or something and knock you off the platform instead. So do be careful with that. I think in this game, the damage is pretty fair, except for this broken knee that you do. I mean, you can spam, like I said, you can spam and abuse that, but when you get hit, it's not too bad, unless you get hit by a boss. Now, outside of that, I'd say the level of difficulty in this game can be challenging, but the beautiful thing here is there is a code you can put in. Definitely, I highly recommend learning that code so you can continue. And one thing to note with the code changes per level. So I think levels 1 through 3 have one type of code. Level 4 through 5, I believe, 4, 5, and 6 have a different code you got to put in, and the last one has a code you have to put in with the second controller for the later stages. So be mindful of that. If you're going to use the codes, make sure you have a second controller plugged in, or if you're playing with a buddy, it's okay, make sure you do it on the second controller. Now, there are bosses at the end of the stages. They're not too challenging, especially with this broken knee. I mean, it just basically a couple of hits with the knee and it kills them. One of the things I appreciate with this game are the environmental changes. Like, for example, here you're on the helicopter and then the door randomly opens and you can fly out the door. I think that's a pretty nice touch they put into the game as well. So in my opinion, I think Double Dragon 2 was innovative on the first one, did take a lot more chances. At the same time, they did, in my opinion, up the level of difficulty with the platforming. So, but overall, if you combine the two things together, I feel like you'll definitely get a decent experience when you're playing Double Dragon 2. I feel like it was a step in the right direction, especially adding the 2-player co-op element, which was sorely missing from the first Double Dragon game on the NES. Overall, I give Double Dragon 2 a thumbs up. And one thing to note with Double Dragon 2 is they did show it a lot of love on the PlayStation 4 with another version of Double Dragon 2, which kept a lot of the same similarities as the original game. So if you're a fan of Double Dragon 2 like I am, I highly recommend you go back to the PlayStation 4 because that's where I played it. It might have came out on Xbox, I'm not 100% sure, but I remember playing it for the PlayStation 4. Definitely take a look at Double Dragon on the PlayStation 4. You won't regret it. Next up at number 6, we got The Adventures of Bayou Billy. Now this game came out in 1989 and was made by Konami. Now Konami was on a tear back in NES days and made a ton of great games. And a lot of people feel like Bayou Billy just sucks. I'd be inclined to agree with them. For one, Bayou Billy was just stupidly hard and for no reason at all. I feel like they just wanted to punish people for some reason when they made this game. So if we take a look at it, you have Game A, Game B, Practice Mode, and Sound Mode. The difference with Game A and Game B is not difficulty, so to speak, but what Bayou Billy does that a lot of games didn't do at the time, with the exception of Battletoads that we just looked at, was they implemented 3 types of gameplay, which was rare at the time on the NES. You had the regular game where you play the beat 'em up style, going through the levels. You actually had a light zapper mode where you could actually use your Nintendo NES zapper, and it had a driving area where you actually had to traverse the game in a vehicle. Game A was basically if you used the zapper, and Game B was you can use the control pad and still use, if you didn't have the light zapper gun, you can actually move the crosshairs along the screen and aim at your enemies when you shoot. Sounds like fun, right? So let's take a look at Bayou Billy. So the game starts out with basically Gordon, it's this guy here, and he captures your girlfriend, Annabelle. And again, damsel in distress, somebody gets captured. Now, Bayou Billy, if you ask me, the soundtrack just kicks ass. Prior probably ranks him in the top 10 of my NES soundtracks. However, soundtracks alone don't carry a game. Now, the graphics, to be honest, the graphics look pretty decent. All the character sprites are proportioned to their body shape. Bayou Billy looks like, well, guy that lives in the bayou. The hat's a nice touch. And enemies look pretty cool. Now, outside of that, the game just falls apart. For one, the difficulty in this game is like ungodly ridiculous. Now, you do get 3 men. This is not one death and you're done. However, AI villains are like all on speed and PCP. They take 100 hits to kill, and they're fast as all get out, and when they hit you once, it takes a whole square of damage. Now you only got 7 squares, and definitely you're gonna get hit 7 times. The collision on this game is pretty bad, and you don't really knock the enemy back or anything. Once you hit them, they kind of freeze in place and keep advancing forward. So basically, the only way to defeat these guys is to dance around and outmaneuver them and land a hit and run, rinse and repeat. God help you if it's 3 of them on the screen, because that makes it 3 times as hard. And these guys are relentless. They have no shame of double or even triple teaming you. To their credit though, every now and again they will drop you a life power up, and that will replenish all your life. Then you got these flying eagles. Not really difficult, but can catch you off guard. Now, Bayou Billy doesn't have a lot of platforming elements, but one part here is when you're going to pass a swamp. And inside the swamp are these relentless alligators that take 5 million hits to defeat. Now you can omit them for the most part, or you can decide to stick around and keep hitting them. I'd say better just bypass them unless you're trying to get a power up. Next up, you got these 3 guys here that take crap ton of damage to kill. Now one thing I will say with Bayou Billy is the weapons. When they drop a weapon, definitely pick it up. I think the best thing you can have right here is a stick, and the reason being, it does hit the enemy, it takes more damage than usual, and you can strike from a further distance. But even with that, they're still going to get their hits in every now and then. So I recommend strike the enemy once out of range and back off. And then you got these guys here that have pistols, and they take a crap ton of damage. They're not too threatening because you can stand on top of the pond and just kick them while they're still in the water. So that is a small victory. Take what you can get. Eventually, one of these villains will drop a revolver. Another horrible enemy that you have to face is this big monsoon looking guy that just swings this big plank at you, and he doesn't drop the plank. So basically, if you're in his range, once he swings that thing forward, more than likely you're getting hit by it. And since they have no pushback on him, the best thing you can do is try to outmaneuver him and not let him trap you in the corner. Now you can use your gun here, but you're going to use all the bullets more than likely on these couple of villains here. One thing to note, you can switch between your gun and your primary attack weapon by hitting the select button. But just the overlay of the game, in my opinion, the way the map flows is pretty bad because it's such a long map and a lot of stuff to traverse. However, you do get the option to continue, so that is one plus, but you're going to need your continues. Now also at the beginning of the game, you do have practice modes where it kind of gets you used to what you will encounter later on in the game. You have the street fighting part. Now one part is a small shortened version of the first level, where you kind of get a feel of the enemies and what it's like to fight on the ground. And it is very challenging just to be a practice stage. However, if you do manage to get through this practice stage, you are awarded with, as a reward, you will receive a meatball. But hey, it's better than nothing, I guess. So each time you complete a level, you actually get some type of reward. So if we look here at the driving game, it's insanely hard because anything that you touch results in death. If you crash into a car, you die. You do have a machine gun with unlimited shots, but the way the roads wind and everything, and the collision makes it hard to aim. Also, one hit from this helicopter and you're dead. Game over. Another part that you can play is the part with the light zapper, which responds surprisingly well on this game, or you can use the controller and the crosshair, again which responds well. But you only start with 100 bullets. And there's a few power-ups along the way you can pick up, but the stage is so long, more than likely if you miss that power-up that replenishes your bullets, you're pretty much done. And instead of just running out of bullets towards the end and taking the hits, when you run out of bullets here, you die. I don't know what that's all about, but yeah, game over. You run out of bullets, you just can't take shots and dodge, pretty much the game's over. So the difficulty on Bayou Billy is ungodly hard and unforgiving. So while the game has great graphics, a killer soundtrack, and good gameplay mechanics, the game just suffers from being ungodly hard. And I don't see why they put this level of difficulty in the game. And what makes it even more shocking is Konami was synonymous with making great games for the NES. So why have a game with such good potential and make it so freaking bad? And crank the difficulty up and basically ruin the game. Well, you might be asking why I put Bayou Billy so high up on this list, if the game is just utterly not fun because of the difficulty. Well, believe it or not, this isn't the true way Bayou Billy was meant to be played. So as a bonus, we're going to take a look at the Japanese version of Bayou Billy, which in Japan is called Mad City. Now, Mad City is basically Bayou Billy in Japan. And it kind of showcases how the game originally released and was meant to be played. And you'll see that it's a totally different game and definitely deserves to be high up on this chart. So let's take a look at Mad City. Now this is Mad City for the Famicom system that came out in Japan. And you can see there are similarities with the screen. However, what you're looking at here is actually the Japanese version that has been generously translated to English so the US audience can enjoy it in English as opposed to Japanese subtitles. So this version of the ROM is actually Mad City translated to English. Now there are some major differences with this game. As you can see at the very beginning, look how fast Bayou Billy moves. In the US version, he moves a lot slower. Also, look at the enemies. Now they're green in color as opposed to red and blue. And look at the damage. They actually die like a normal adversary would. A couple of kicks and you can put them down. Now with Bayou Billy's increased speed, his maneuverability is a lot better, so he can actually have the jump on, putting his attack out first and registering hits. Also, the enemies actually die like they're supposed to with 2 or 3 hits, making them more reasonable in this game. Also with the enemy dropping more power-ups than they did in the US version of Bayou Billy. If you look here at the swamp, it's actually traversed a little different. You don't have those planks anymore that you have to walk across, it's just marshlands, and the swamp is a lot shorter. And here's the guys with the rocks again. His color's been altered as well. He does move a lot slower than his American counterpart. The villains in Mad City actually do move slower than the ones in the US version. So the US version, Bayou Billy moves slower and the enemies move faster. In this version, it's the exact opposite. So now, in my opinion, the game is actually playable. You can actually get somewhere in the game without wanting to punch a hole in your screen. Now, I'm not 100% sure if you can do this in the US version, but in the Japanese version, Bayou Billy can actually punch and deflect bullets. That's how much of a badass he is in the Japanese version, Mad City. And remember how crazy this guy with the big board was? Well, you can actually put him down with a couple of shots, as opposed to all the damage he can take in the US version. And in this version as well, the alligators aren't as aggressive. So you can actually realistically clear a stage without losing a life. Another thing you'll notice as well is in the Japanese version Mad City, Annabelle's dressed differently. In this version, she has a full-length red dress. In the American version, she's wearing a tank top and Daisy Dukes. That's another change they made from Mad City to Bayou Billy. Another big change they made with the Japanese version is that you start off in the shooting part of the game with 150 bullets as opposed to only 100 in the US version. And also they do drop a lot more power-ups as opposed to the ones they drop in the US version, making the Japanese version that much easier. Or not even easy, just normal. So you absolutely could complete this level and not have to worry about running out of ammunition if you play sensibly. So obviously there were a lot of change, and then the driving parts revamped as well. Meaning you don't die with one hit from everything. You actually have an actual dedicated meter where you can take hits and actually survive. Now some things will still kill you instantly, but for the most part, you actually have a meter. If you get hit when you're driving, you actually don't instantly die. So I feel like Mad City is probably the Bayou Billy game we never got, but should have. And that's really a shame because the version of Bayou Billy we got so much hate in the US because of its difficulty. And we often wonder why would Konami make such a shit game when they were infamously known for making great games? Well, here's the truth. There was actually 2 versions of the game. That Bayou Billy with the extreme difficulty that everybody hated, and then the actual Mad City that was actually a very fun game that took advantage of merging all 3 of the elements of the game together nicely. The shooting, the driving, and the beat 'em up portion of the game. It's a shame that a lot of people never got to play this game, but the good news is there is a ROM out there floating around, fully English patched, of Mad City, so you can finally play Bayou Billy the way it was meant to be played. So while Bayou Billy in the US sucked ass, I highly recommend you go out and play Mad City and give Bayou Billy the chance that it's always deserved. Next up at number 5, we got Battletoads Double Dragon. the Ultimate Team. Now this game came out in 1993, made by Rare. In my opinion, this game surpassed the original. Now that's a matter of opinion and that is up for debate. But my reason being that the game wasn't as unforgivably hard in my opinion as the original Battletoads was. However, I will say Battletoads 1 did have a better level design. But again, that's debatable, that's my opinion. So we take a look at the game, you had 1 and 2 player modes. And the graphics in this game are just as impressive as the first game. Starting you off on a ship and with a huge crossover of Double Dragon universe and the Battletoads universe. Now if you're familiar with the Battletoads 1 gameplay, you'll be right at home on this game, with the exception of some of the level designs being a little different, and the incorporation of the Double Dragon twins. The music on this game, in my opinion, was actually better than the original. That's debatable, but again, my opinion. What made this game really fun for me was the fact that all the things you can do in the environment. You could climb on the ledges, they have power-ups along the way, and while the fights were intense, they weren't impossible. So in my opinion, the level of difficulty had been toned down a little bit for this game, while still retaining a lot of the elements of the original, such as picking up weapons, your powered up charge attack, and the infamous repelling scenes. I feel like they did everything the original did for the most part, but just turned it up a level. Another awesome part of this game was the crossover. I did enjoy the crossover feature with the Bobo actually fighting with the Battletoads and vice versa, the Dragon Twins fighting with enemies in the Battletoads universe. And I did appreciate a lot of the level design as far as being able to climb ladders, climb on certain parts of the screen to traverse obstacles. As in previous games, you actually have to fly through the level and traverse obstacles on a motorized craft. And the boss fights were pretty nice as well. And while being easy for the most part, it was still fun that you had to figure out each pattern for each enemy you were fighting. Once you figure out the pattern though, the boss was pretty easy, but still in the same sense, satisfying to defeat. I always thought this part right here was pretty ruthless. When you fight Linda in this game, I mean the Battletoads just straight gangster this chick. The way they yank her hair, I mean they just straight gangster this chick. I thought it was funny and kind of cruel at the same time. But the sprites on this game look amazing, and the music is also a treat to behold in its own sense. This game, in my opinion, is basically a total package, as far as crossover, improvement on the first Battletoads game, and including a great crossover with 2 great franchises that were on the NES at the time. So what's it like if you pick Double Dragon Twins? Well, basically they play somewhat the same. Some of the moves are different, they still have the drop kick, but they do revert more to their Double Dragon counterpart moves. As far as the jump kick, the grab and knee smash, they still retain that move, a flying elbow drop. So you do get a different feel depending on which character you pick, giving you more variation and styles and ways to play the game. So overall, I feel like Battletoads and Double Dragon, instant classic on the NES and a true winner, and I highly recommend you play this game. Next up at number 4, we have Mighty Final Fight. Now everybody's played Final Fight. Now this game is similar to the arcade in a lot of ways, but kind of does its own thing as well. Now this game came out more towards the later end of the NES's life cycle, in 1993, obviously made by Capcom. So a Final Fight being on other platforms, such as the Super NES, I feel like Nintendo did a good Final Fight on the NES series by maximizing all the NES's potential and including a Final Fight experience on the NES. Now you can pick from 1 of 3 characters, obviously Cody, Guy, and Hagar, each one having their signature powers and moves. Guy being the fastest, Cody being your more standard fighter, and Hagar obviously being the grappler. And each character does play different. Now the sprites in this game are more reminiscent of a chibi experience, meaning like small kid versions of their adult form, which I think they pull off nicely. The controls of this game are very responsive, as most Capcom games are, and the sprites actually look like the characters, with the walking animation and have their signature moves. And in the same fashion, if you hit both buttons, you'll do their super move. Now, at the bottom you have a level meter, and once it hits level 4, each character has another move that you can unlock and do. Now one thing with the controls, it is kind of hard to do that move every now and then, but once you practice it, you can get it down. Cody's move is obviously by default the uppercut when you mash the punch combination. I was able to pull it off by pushing forward and punch, and sometimes the energy wave would come out and other times it wouldn't. But overall, it wasn't enough for the game to be broken. One thing Mighty Final Fight does right is they bring back all the characters from the original Final Fight for the most part. We have Roxy, Poison. This big guy that actually blocks stuff, I don't really remember him from the first game. Maybe I missed him. When you encounter bosses in this game, they do have a pattern. Initially, they'll be kind of tough, but once you figure out their pattern, they're pretty much a cakewalk at that point. So basically, it's all about timing, letting the enemy do their sequence, and then countering for the most part. So overall, still a pretty good experience. Every couple of rounds, you are introduced to a bonus stage, where these barrels will come across the screen and you got to make sure you hit them all. Capcom was famous for having these mini games in between rounds and in between levels. They put a lot of them in fighting games, and this should be no exception, being a Capcom fighter, even if it is a beat 'em up. Now this game is pretty short, and you do have a certain amount of continues, but at the same time, I feel like the game does keep your interest long enough through the levels to make you want to see what happens next. Now while the AI isn't too hard, they're not afraid to double team you if need be. So make sure you're keeping an eye on all enemies on the screen at the same time and watching what they're doing. As far as Cody does, he does mostly punches and walks at a moderate speed. He's kind of the guy in between. Now Guy's actually good for his speed, and he does more karate type moves. He actually performs rapid punches and finishes off his attack with a kick. Then we have the mayor of Metro City, Hagar, and he's more known for power, basically having the signature moves, the flying pile driver, and his special move also is the spinning lariat, and he has his signature gut punch. Has a lot of range. He actually moves the slowest of all the characters, obviously. So I think what makes Mighty Final Fight so good is, if you ever wanted to play Final Fight on the NES, it was hard to do because at the time, graphic limitations, this game wasn't even thought of. I feel like as the NES further got fleshed out, they were able to create these games that were thought to be unheard of at the time, making an NES debut. So while Final Fight is not as intense as his bigger brother on the Super NES, it still does a really good job in a bite-sized form on the old original NES. So I highly recommend playing this one through and experiencing an official release of Final Fight on the Nintendo Entertainment System. A perfect snapshot bite size of Final Fight, done very well on the NES. Now the number 1, 2, and 3 spot are personal favorites of mine that have a special place in my heart for various reasons. And to some might not be the best of the games, but I will explain to you, in my personal opinion, why I feel like these 3 games are the best. In the number 3 spot, we got Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Arcade. Now this game came out in 1990, and at the time, Turtle Mania was running wild. Now I know there was an NES game that they made, the original Ninja Turtles, before this game. And people were so upset with that game because its level of difficulty and how much it straight up sucked. This was not the Ninja Turtles. When I saw Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, because if you didn't know, at the time Ninja Turtles in Arcade was out, and that was the experience everybody was hoping for on the NES. Now obviously Ninja Turtles in Arcade was a quarter-eaten machine. Everybody played Ninja Turtles Arcade, and that machine was everywhere. They had 4-player versions of it, 2-player versions of it. That machine, the hype of Turtle Mania was at its all-time high. With the cartoon, with the 1987 Turtles cartoon, the 1990 Turtles movie, and so forth. You had cereal, bed linen, anything you can think of, you had Ninja Turtles. So when this game came out, it had big shoes to fill. Every kid in America had played the Ninja Turtles arcade game, but the promise of making this game available in your own home was quite the task to fill, and I think Ultra Games killed it. In my opinion, this was the truest to this thing was incredibly accurate and true to its arcade big brother. At the beginning, you could pick 1 or 4 turtles, and you're actually treated to the opening cutscene that you get in the arcade, even down to the detail of Michelangelo not landing the jump. Now, obviously, this game didn't talk like the arcade. I mean, let's be real, NES did have its limitations. But that's a small thing to factor out when you figure everything else they put in the game. The music for each stage, you actually got the right music for the right stage in each level. And if you look at the details here, you got the fire at the bottom of the screen, just like the arcade. You got the foot soldiers, you got the balls that come down the stairs, and you even have the robots at the end of the stage. As far as level design, they put all the enemies in the right spot they're supposed to be in the arcade counterpart. As far as the guys with the guns that are supposed to be in this room in the arcade, as well as Rocksteady making his entrance from the ground like he does in the arcade. And as far as sprites go, as far as NES standards, I feel like they nailed it here. This actually looks like the arcade version. Now one thing I didn't like about it, how they made Rocksteady like solid gray. I thought that was a little weird, but I can forgive that with everything else they put in the game. Even the enemy's attack pattern mimics the arcade counterpart. So they put a lot of love and detail into this game. Now another thing to point out with the gameplay mechanics, there's very little slowdown, and each turtle replicates its own moves. The jumping slash attack is just as good here as it was in arcade, and that's the main thing you're going to abuse throughout your playthrough. It actually functions like it's supposed to. Not like Double Dragon where the elbows in arcade is king, and on the home system it does nothing. Even small details like here where they show the TV and Shredder and April on there, I thought that was a nice touch they put in from the arcade counterpart. They also put in all the stages on the street where you're on the skateboard and everything like that. They included all those parts and put the right music where it was supposed to be. Also made this game awesome at the time was they actually took the time, I don't know how they did it, but they actually were able to squeeze in 2 more levels and new enemies that weren't in the arcade counterpart. One of the stages we're looking at here is like a Japanese stage with cool innovations like this tiger coming to life off the background and you having to fight it. At the time, that was pretty freaking cool. Not to mention only a new stage, but they also had 2 new console exclusive bosses. You can see Shogun right here, and he has his own set of attacks and new moves. So that was like a bonus to have 2 extra bosses and stages in the game. And then they were, in my opinion, I thought they were spot on with the techno drum as well. They put all the enemies in the right spot, all the bosses in the right spot, and the music, if you listen to the music, it was very close and on par with the arcade version of the techno drum music, which is probably my favorite music out the whole game. Even this part here with the scaling of the elevator and the balls coming down like in an arcade, I feel like for the NES, they nailed it. With the background movement and the elevator coming down, it felt like you were really on the elevator. I feel like they pushed the machine to its maximum limits with memory and programming to create this game for us, and they did one heck of a job. I feel like for the most part, nothing was left out. It was actually true to give you the arcade experience at home. Which is one thing Nintendo is not really known for. Normally when we get a port of a game from the arcade on the NES, you usually got some parts of the game with different variations, and usually Sega Master System and the Sega Genesis gave you a complete arcade experience. But this is one of the times where I feel like the NES actually gave you the actual arcade machine just shrunk down. Epic game. If you've never played this version of Ninja Turtles on the NES, I highly recommend you play this one. Masterclass performance. Next up in the number 2 spot, we have the original Double Dragon for the NES. Now this one came out in 1988, Technos Japan Core, and this one had a little bit of controversy. I guess the main thing was, just like Ninja Turtles before it, well, when I say before it, I mean this review, Ninja Turtles came out after Double Dragon did, but with that said, Double Dragon was famous in arcade for Double Dragon, 2-player. And when we found out, I know as a kid, when I found out that Double Dragon was releasing with just one person, and I was so damn jealous that the Sega Master System had 2 players. I was crushed. I was like, Nintendo usually gets it right, and so because I got a Master System late. I had an NES first before I got my Master System. So when I found out that all my buddies that had a Master System had 2 players, I was crushed. However, with that said, I feel like this game, Double Dragon, did make up for the 2, or at least in my eyes, kind of made up for not having 2 players. 2 players would have been great. And there is actually a mod out there, guys, where you can play the original Double Dragon on NES that's actually 2-player. But we're talking about the original OG in its base form. So what did it do to compensate for the lack of 2-player co-op? Well, I think they did quite nicely. I think they did a really good job with the music. One thing I will say with the music is it was a little difficult to endure at first, only because it's so much faster in tempo than the actual arcade. And if you listen to the 2, you can tell the arcade has its own flair, and the Nintendo one just goes a little too fast and sounds, you know, real chiptune and 8-bit, which it was an 8-bit system, but still, it didn't feel like the arcade experience. And to be fair, it was, in my opinion, this game really didn't deliver the arcade experience. However, it did deliver a whole nother experience in its own right. So think of it as taking the characters from Double Dragon, but making a whole new game, if that makes any sense. Now, some of the stages look a lot like the arcade, but the gameplay is totally different from its arcade counterpart. For one, it's not 2-player. 2, Jimmy's a bad guy. And one thing this series introduced was, as far as I know, now correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, because I might be wrong, because that's possible, I don't know everything. This was the first time they were addressed in my mind. This is the first time to my knowledge that these two characters were addressed as Billy and Jimmy Lee. I knew them in the arcade as Spike and Hammer, and I'm sure there's a reason for that. So please, if you know in the comments, let me know. So in my mind, it gave them more background, gave them more of a lore, and made them enemies as opposed to being friends. Well, I don't know how much friends they are if you beat up your brother at the end and kill him over a girl in the arcade version. I don't know how much friends you are, but at the same time here they are just straight up enemies. Now another part that makes the gameplay system different from the arcade is you don't have access to all your moves in the very beginning. You have a level up system where at the beginning you have a punch, a kick, and a jump, but you have to basically unlock your moves. So at the bottom left hand corner you can see under our life meter we have a couple of hearts. Each heart represents you being able to do a new move. And once you hit 999 points, you can see right here where a heart adds on and now another move is unlocked, which I thought kind of gave it RPG elements in a sense and was kind of cool and made it different from its arcade counterpart. Still doesn't make up for the lack of 2 players, but hey, it's a start. Also moving on, in this game as opposed to the arcade, there's actually a lot of platforming elements. And one of the things that makes this game pretty hard are the stage environmentals. Now you did have a couple in the arcade with the sliding bricks coming out of the wall, and that one infamous jump that took everybody's money in the 3rd level of the arcade. But here you actually have platforms to jump on. Here you actually have moving platforms and stage environmentals you gotta look out for, falling stalagmites. So that was another touch they introduced into the game. Other influences kind of come from stage 1. At the end of stage 1, you do fight a Bobo, but not in the traditional sense like you would in the arcade. Here it looks like to me like they kind of mixed the first level with the second level with the conveyor belt. Now we know the conveyor belt's on the second level of Double Dragon in the arcade, but for here for some reason it's on the first level. So some of the things did overlap. I'd say overall with Double Dragon's difficulty level, not too hard. The main thing that made it hard was pretty much the throne room at the end where you fight Willie, because he doesn't play anything like his arcade counterpart. And then some of the jumps and background environments you gotta deal with in the later stages of the game. But for the most part, this game plays smooth, the hit detection's good, controls are very responsive, and there are little tips and tricks you can do along the way. One being here, that was a secret back in the day, was an invisible enemy where you could max your level with no problem. So I'll share that with you real quick. And it's very simple to do. You had to do it on the second stage. And what you do is when you got to the top of this platform right here, you came down the gate right here. You went over to the enemy right here where Williams got into the screen. And once he stopped at the girders right there, you started to climb the fence. Then you walked out of the screen, made the enemies disappear. Make sure you go far enough to without the screen. I always climbed down the fence to give myself double insurance to where the screen couldn't go back anymore. And then you make your way back over there. When you go back, it will appear to be gone, but they're actually just invisible. And you can hit where the enemy once was, and bam, now you're hitting an invisible ghost, and you are leveling up to your heart's content. No pun intended. And you go all the way up until you max out your character with all of his moves. I remember doing this. This was basically a staple whenever I played this game. I'd make sure to do that. Another glitch in the game was having the bat for the end of the second stage. Now it's pretty simple to do. All you would do is carry the whip up to the ladder. Once you got up top, let Linda hit you and drop the whip. Dispose of the 2 Lindas on this stage, and as they die, pick up the whip, and now it turns into a bat. And it made your fight up top a lot easier. But if you already had all your hearts like I got here, you really don't need this bat. I just thought I'd share that with you guys. Another part that made Double Dragon different from its arcade counterpart was the fact that it had holes you had to go in. So if you're playing the game, I remember playing this game initially, right here you're supposed to go into one of these holes to advance the game. However, if you continue to walk forward, you'll miss your opening and the game will just loop until you get back there again. I remember when I first got the game, that wasn't a thing in the arcade, so I kept going over and over and kept missing the door until I accidentally ended up going inside the door. So that's one thing to note from the arcade version to the home port. Now one thing to note about this game is there are no continues. Once you die, that's pretty much it, game over. So be very careful navigating areas like this, such as the stalagmites falling in the caves, because once they knock you down, sometimes they can just sometimes you can get trapped infinitely on the ground and can't get back up. And then meticulous jumps you had throughout the game, as seen as in these platforms right here, you have to be very careful. Another shortcut you could take here was Once you got right outside the enemy fortress, you can let this Linda knock you off this ladder right here and you'll fall right down to the platform you need to be on. But you have to be careful, but sometimes it can be glitchy. When you hit the ground, you'll keep bouncing. If that's happened to you before, if you played this game before where you fell off something and you just start bouncing on the ground, you'll know what I'm talking about. But anyway, you can save a lot of time here by just getting knocked to the bottom right here and being right above the entry door you need to be in. Double Dragon NES actually did add a lot more levels that the arcade didn't have. So at this point, I feel like they're winning me over with the fact of not having 2-player, because I feel like it was a whole new game all in itself. And at the end, you have the throne room here, and you fight pretty much like you do in an arcade. And I really want to say I really appreciate their implementation of their version of the throne room with all the characters. Another little thing I want to point out with Double Dragon, which is minor, but I feel like it's worth mentioning. If you look at Jimmy Lee here, he looks different than he did in the beginning. Right here, he's rocking a red outfit and blonde hair. In the very beginning of the game, he looks totally different with blue hair. I don't know if he was just a placeholder here, or a programmer forgot to change his hair, or maybe he dyed his hair. Who knows? It's the 80s. Anything's possible. But that's one thing I wanted to point out. The last part of Double Dragon we'll point out is the optional game mode they had in there, which is kind of a versus mode, and I thought was pretty cool at the time. The only crappy part was that you couldn't intermatch the characters. So if you picked whatever character you picked, it was a mirror match. Not so much a Billy versus a Bobo or a Linda versus a Roper. Basically, a splitting image mirror match. Now you can play with 2 players, or you can play against the computer. And the computer can be kind of rough if you don't get the pattern right for him. But overall, while this wasn't really a big deal, it was still a good right in its own. This standalone, if you ask me, this standalone versus portion of the game is actually better than some actual full complete Nintendo games. I'm sure you can think of a few stinkers out there that just totally suck, that this little portion of the game, this little extra tidbit, is actually better than the whole functioning game. I feel like the sprites were huge, and I always wondered why they didn't make the sprites, I guess because of memory, because I can understand it now as a grown-up, because maybe memory constraints, but I always wondered why they didn't make the sprites look like this throughout the whole game. That would have been epic. But I think they did a really good job with the move list, the battle system in this little mini game, and just the extra effort they put in. So overall, I feel like Double Dragon, while it was missing the second player, I feel like they more than made up for it with all the new innovations they put into the game. This one definitely holds a place near and dear in my heart as being one of my favorite games for the NES. And at number 1, of course, we have my all-time favorite, probably my top 3 games for the NES, and a game that just changed my life forever was River City Ransom for the NES. Made in 1989, developed by Technos Japan, this was the fighting game to have. I think I clocked in over thousands of hours playing this game. I mean, if you ask me, I feel like this was the total package of what a fighting game should be. It had 2-player co-op mode. It had the most moves out of any beat 'em up game made for the NES, and the possibilities and customization in this game was endless. It was a beat 'em up game that had strong RPG elements and set a precedence of what, in my opinion, a beat 'em up game should be. I mean, you could do everything in this game. You could customize your character in a non-linear way. The character can have strong attributes wherever you want to put them. Characters actually had moves they could pull off. The bosses had secret attacks exclusive to them only. And the storyline, even though cliche as it was, your girlfriend getting captured, still made for a great story. Another part of the cool RPG elements was you'd have to beat a boss and get information from that boss to find your next rival you had to fight. So essentially, you were playing a beat 'em up game and an RPG game in one. And the music in this game was off the charts. The music fit the game perfectly and was very memorable and iconic. When you hear this jingle, you know what time it is, you know what game we're talking about. So the premise of the game is, all the students have went rogue in River City and are under the influence of their leader, Slick. Basically, your girlfriend's been captured and it's up to you to get her back. So you have to go through all the gangs in the city, find Slick at his hideout, defeat him, and restore order in River City. So one thing this game really needed, and it did have, was a code system. Now the codes were long as all get out. I definitely recommend back in the day when you wrote these down. Nowadays you can just take a smartphone, take a picture of the code and be good to go, or have a save state. But back in the day you had to write this long code down. And if you miss just one thing, you're screwed. So back in the day I made sure I double checked and triple checked the code because it was so damn long. So when you start off, you have basic powers. You have a punch, a kick, a run, a jump, which I think is still a lot of moves for a fighting game just off the bat. You can jump, you can kick, you can pick up, you can pick everything up in the screen as far as objects go. Everything in the screen that you can pick up is essentially a weapon, including enemies. A nice touch with this game as well was the enemies you fought. Now, the sprites look similar to the body styles, but they put so much detail and thought into the faces of the character that each enemy felt unique and looked unique. And also, to give them further uniqueness, which I thought was a hell of a good touch, was each character had their own attributes. So there's 8 to 9 gang members in each gang, each with different attributes. For example, the one right here, he has willpower. And what willpower is basically you can get up after being knocked down, one time at least. This one right here has more agility, and he moves faster than the other gang members, and so forth. So each character had one attribute they specialized in. One was specialized in throw, one specialized in punch, one specialized in kick, one specialized in weapon, and so forth. Now that right there was a huge detail that I thought was very nice instead of being just generic characters. And they even went as far as to give the gangs certain personalities. So certain gangs like the Jocks, they never ran. They would never run across the screen unless they were in proximity trying to attack you or pick up an object. And other gangs, they ran around freely. I thought that was cool to give each gang their own aggression and fighting style. But that's not all they did with levels of detail. They actually had stores you can go into, and they had to actually program all these different foods and stuff. And each food, each book, and each item you acquire in the store gives you different attributes for your character. Now, if we take a look at the attribute screen here, you can see that it's divided into one row. The other row is if you play for 2 players. So you have your punch, kick, weapon, throwing. So you have punch, which is how hard you punch. Kick, self-explanatory. Weapon, whenever you hit someone with a weapon. Throwing is how hard it hurts when you get hit when you throw a weapon and hit someone. Agility is how fast your punches and kicks come out and how fast you can move across the screen. Defense means is automatic. You don't have to push a button for defense. Basically your punch button and defense will come up automatically. The higher your defense, the more likely you are to block your enemy's attack. Strength gives you more strength with your attacks and also some of your special attacks. Willpower gives you more chances of getting up after you've been knocked down, your energy is depleted. You have your stamina and your max power, and I think your max power is 127, and all your attributes with the exception of max power can be maxed to 63. Now how do we max those stats out? Well, basically when you go through the game, every time you beat up an enemy, they drop money. You pick the money up. The harder the enemy, of course, the more money they'll drop. And once you get enough money, you can enter various shops throughout this game, various shops in the strip mall, and some even hidden throughout the game. Once you go inside, you can buy whatever items are inside the store, and it will power you up. Now, most physical attributes will level up right away. In order to level up your max power, your stamina has to be max, meaning you have to be at max level power with your stamina for your max power to take effect. So in other words, if you take something that's going to give you max power on a full life bar, you'll get your max power. Otherwise, the max power will say maxed out and you won't get anything. So make sure if you're carrying, and some items you can use instantly, other items you can carry with you and use at a later time. So if you die, you still keep all your items and you'll start with a full life bar. If you have any items, that's the time to use them so that way you can level up your max power. Also throughout the game, you can get various power-ups, and majority of them come from reading books and learning techniques. Now we'll go over the techniques real fast in this game. The techniques you can find. Now what I want to explain with you before you get these techniques with the game is they're not mandatory for finishing the game, and sometimes even more fun not to get them. Now what do I mean by that? Well, remember when I said the progression system, right? So you don't have to maximize everything. Basically, if you go like Elden Ring, where you can put your stats wherever you want in the character. So you can actually have essentially a class build on here. If you want somebody that just does punches and kicks but's weak at everything else and you want to play the game that way, you can do it. If you want to have it to where they have max agility, they're super fast but they don't hit that hard and it takes more punches, adding to the challenge of the game, you can do that. If you want to be totally broken, you can get all your techniques and do that. So let's go over the techniques, and I think that's really special at the time to have a character class build where you can actually make your own type of fighter. So moving on with the techniques, you got Dragon Feet, which basically turns all your kicks into rapid fire kicks. Stone Hands, which does the same thing just for punches. And you have Javelin Man, which is more a utility, and it's a really fun move to have, but it acts more like a utility. So when you throw an enemy, essentially it's like throwing a javelin. The person goes far across the screen, they'll even traverse water at times if you throw them, and they'll fly to the other end of the screen. Lots of times where you can't even see them anymore. Now if you look, one of the things I enjoy doing, which is pretty stupid, but I just thought it was cool, especially in high school, I take one of the characters and throw them across the screen, and then I chase them just to see what it looked like when they hit the wall. How stupid is that? Dang, back then I just had a good time. I experimented with everything in River City Ransom. Now Grand Slam is probably a broken one because any weapon you pick up, you can do machine gun hits with it. Basically rapid fire machine gun hits with it. So you can pick up a box, brass knuckles, and essentially I thought this kind of negated the other moves because it gave you all the instant things, gave you those instant hits with a weapon. So this is basically something that totally breaks the game. Fatal Steps, it's kind of like a move. I really didn't use this one too often when I played the game. Basically when the person's down, you can come by him and activate this move and kind of just steps on the person when they're on the ground. Whatever. Acro Circus, another fun one. It can be game breaking a little bit. Basically instead of your jump, you hit the jump button, you'll turn to like a ball and you'll just spin and hit all your opponents, which can be game breaking. If you max your strength stat, this move becomes OP and totally broken. So those are a list of the moves you can that are available to you in River City Ransom, and again, that's a lot of moves and a lot of in-depth gameplay that can be had with these sets of moves. Or you can just play the old-fashioned way with none of them and create your build of the character. Now one of the things with the NPCs in the store is they'll vary. Some will give you smiles, and then they have this cheeky cutscene, no pun intended right here, which I thought was hilarious when you're in the sauna. And then to top it off, guys, the dialogue in this game. Now you had the infamous generic things with the generic sayings with the gang members when they fall down, the infamous barf and all that. Those were cool. But when you actually got to characters that any kind of boss character had significant meaning, he'd have his own saying, whatever he would say. But what's even more cool, once you ran across that person again, if you were farming that boss character for money or whatever, they would actually change the dialogue and mention the battle you first had in some kind of way. Either saying, here we go again. They would definitely change the dialogue to let you know that you guys have fought in the past, which I thought was a pretty good touch. Also, what kept the level of excitement with all the stages was the environments. I mean, you could jump up on anything, jump off of anything, attack on anything, potentially even fight on top of environments. So at the time, there was no NES game in the States anyway that did this type of thing. That's what made this thing so iconic. And believe it or not, guys, I actually have my original Nintendo Power that showcased this game. Now, starting off at the beginning of this game, your character is relatively weak. You know, you do have to level up the character. You can potentially go through the game without buying one power-up. That is possible, and it's kind of challenging to do, but fun. But I wouldn't suggest it if it's your first playthrough. Now basically you'll start off with 20 bucks, and you can cycle through by pushing select buttons of how much money you got and Alex's energy. And you can play with 2 players if you'd like, which works very well in this game. This is very fun. So I recommend playing with a buddy if you got somebody close by that enjoys beat 'em up games. But as you go through the game, you'll buy various items, progress, level up, and when you run out of money, you gotta beat up the bad guys for more money. Now, at the beginning, you'll run across a few enemies, and the first boss you'll fight is Moose, and you'll tell by the music will change when a boss comes into the screen. So certain screens, when you beat up all the enemies, the boss character will appear. That's how you make the bosses appear. Sometimes they'll just be standing in certain spots where criteria have been met. For example, Blade in Sherman Park. If you don't do a certain criteria, he won't show up until you unlock a certain amount of criteria and milestones in the game for him to appear. So I thought that was a nice, cool part with the RPG elements of having to do something to interact with other characters to make other characters appear in the game. So you can actually beat this game without all the characters. There's only certain key characters you have to beat to progress the game. Some are just extra optional and hidden, and sometimes you might, if you're first playing through the game, you might actually miss a couple. One tip I'll point out is the best place to farm money is with these 2 guys, Benny and Clyde. Once you get strong enough to one-shot these guys, I highly recommend meeting up with them either in Capitol Avenue Bridge or in front of the sauna, and just keep farming these guys over and over, one hit for money. Each one gives you $3.50, and over time, that money will actually build up. Pretty much once you level up and progress through the game, fight all the bad guys, you'll end up at the high school. And at the high school, that's where you have your final showdown with Ivan and Tex. They'll be the high school guards. You have to beat those two to advance the game. And what's cool about these guys, they got their own signature attacks. With them being high up on the food chain of villains, Ivan right here has a headbutt, and it's pretty damaging. If you get hit by it, it's personal to him. Nobody else in the game has the move. And the same thing with Tex. If he has his stick, he'll do his signature spinning move attack, and it takes a good amount of damage. Now, one of the biggest surprises to me that was kind of unheard of at the time was the infamous Dragon Twins. I mean, when I first got to them and I heard that music playing, I was like, no way, because crossovers at the time, back in the day, guys, aren't like they are today where everything crosses over. Back in the day, a crossover was a big deal. And when I saw this, I was like, holy smokes. And then they actually had the spin kick move, kind of in line with the cyclone kick, and they were tough. But even still, the level of detail of these guys, they weren't carbon copies. One was faster than the other, one was stronger than the other, so both of them were super strong, but they had, they were different in a sense. So yeah, I thought that was, and they're tough. If you fight them, and obviously if you got everything leveled up, you can easily overpower them, but if you kind of come in at just kind of medium, they can be quite a challenge. So I felt like, 2-on-2, playing 2-on-2 fighting these guys, I mean, that was just a very fun experience, and kind of revolutionary at the time to have that level of crossover with a popular franchise like Double Dragon in this game. And lastly, we got Slick. Now, one thing I want to point out that maybe a lot of people didn't know that I noticed back in the day when I played this game. There's 2 levels in this game, right? You can play Novice and Advanced. And when you play Novice, all the characters are weaker. And when you play Advanced, they're all significantly buffed. For some reason, when you fight Slick on the Novice level, he's actually stronger than he is when you turn the game on Advanced. Now I'll show you here, if I'm fighting on the actual normal default Novice level, it's harder to kill him. He takes a lot more damage. He can actually sustain a lot more damage. Now, if you watch here, when I switch it on Advanced, he actually takes less damage and less hits to kill. So I don't know if that was just a glitch. I don't know why they did that. I really have no idea. Maybe it was just a glitch in the system. I don't know. But that's one thing that I always found weird as a kid. Like I said, I explored the heck out of this doggone game. So overall, with all the innovations, the great graphic sprites, the limitless variations of ways you can play this game, the fun factor, the music, and just everything this game did right at the time, including the co-op and non-linear gameplay and hidden bosses, I felt like this was the epitome of what a beat-em-up game on the NES should be. And there are, in my opinion, very few games that can rival this level of ingenuity and innovation in 1989. So guys, that's going to do it pretty much for these games. I hope you enjoyed the video. I had a ton of fun going back and revisiting these old games and playing them again. A lot of these games I haven't played in over 20 years, so it was cool to actually go back, play these games, and share my insight with you guys on how the games impacted me and just some of my favorites that were on the NES. Now I know there's some that didn't make the list, and I apologize, I couldn't put them all in there. This video is long enough as it is. But let me know in the comments some of your favorite games. And again, if you didn't agree with the order I put them in, I totally understand. I mean, it was a lot of heavy hitters on this list, and I put my personal favorites in the order I felt like they ranked in, but I know that's probably totally different from what you think. So that's gonna do it for this video, guys. Please rate, comment, and subscribe, as it helps the channel grow, and that way you don't miss any more reviews or gaming information on this channel. And with that, guys, as always, take care of yourself. God bless, protect your inner peace, and we'll catch you on the next one. Thank you for watching.